Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janabalabha Girivardhari Jai Gopi Janabalabha Girivardhari Yasoda Nandana Brajana Yasoda Nandana Brajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ramo Hare Ramo Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jai Om Vishnupad Paramhamsa Paravajakacharya Tadasata Shri Śrīmad Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Grantaraj Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam Ki Samveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Gaur Premanandi. All glories to Simul devotees. All glories to Simul devotees. All glories to Simul devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. So we are on second canto, 6th chapter, text 2 today, is that correct? What's that? Right, 2 and 3, that's what Hari Vilas had updated. He changed all, I guess when Ram Roy spoke on 1 yesterday, bumped everybody else up 1 notch or whatever it was. And there's no purport to 2, so we have to do 3, which has a 1-sentence purport. But that's kind of the way it is for the next 10 verses or something like that. You get 1 or 2 sentence purports. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Gananjana Shalakhaya Chakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamhahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragunatam Vitam Tam Sujivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. All right. So we'll read the Sanskrit for verse 2.6.2, and then I'll just go over the Sanskrit on the next verse. Sarvasunam chavayoscha. Are we in the right place? Okay. Sarvashunam chavayoscha. Tanase paramayane. Tanase paramayane. Ashvinor oshadinam cha. Ashvinor oshadinam cha. Grahano moda Grahno moda pramodayoho. Grahano moda pramodayaha. Sarvasunam chavayoscha. Tannase paramayane. Ashvinor oshadhinam cha. Grano moda pramodayaha. Sarvasunam chavayoscha. Tannase paramayane. Ashvinor oshadhinam cha. Grano moda pramodayo. Sarvasunam chavayoscha. Tannase paramayane. Ashvinor oshadhinam cha. Grano moda pramodayo. Sarvasunam chavayoscha. Tannase paramayane. Ashvinor oshadhinam cha. Grano moda pramodayaha. Sarvasunam chavayoscha. Tannase paramayane. Ashvinor oshadhinam cha. Grano moda pramodayo. Sarvasunam chavayoscha. Tannase paramayane. Ashvinor oshadhinam cha. Grano moda pramodayo. Sarvam, all. Ashunam, different kinds of life air. Cha, and. Vayo, of the air. Cha, also. Tat, his. Na, se, in the nose. Parama ayane, in the transcendental generating center. Ashvinaho, of the Ashvini Kumar demigods. Oshadinam, of all medicinal herbs. Cha, also. Granaha, his smelling power. Moda, pleasure. Pramodayoho, specific sport. The translation reads, his two nostrils are the generating centers of our breathing and of all other airs. His smelling powers generate the Ashvini Kumar demigods and all kinds of medicinal herbs. And his breathing energies produce different kinds of fragrance. So I say, and you all please repeat. His two nostrils are the generating centers of our breathing and of all other airs. His smelling powers generate the Ashvini Kumar demigods and all kinds of medicinal herbs. And his breathing energies Produce different kinds of fragrance. Okay, so there's no purport. We'll read the next one. Rupanam tejasam chakshur divya suryasya chakshini karnao disham chatirtanam shrotram akasha shabdayoho. His eyes are the generating centers of all kinds of forms, and they glitter and illuminate. His eyeballs are like the sun and the heavenly planets. His ears hear from all sides and are the receptacles for all the Vedas. And his senses, and his sense of hearing is the generating center of the sky and all kinds of sound. So I'll read that again. His eyes are the generating centers of all kinds of forms, and they glitter and illuminate. His eyeballs are like the sun and the heavenly planets. His ears hear from all sides and are the receptacles for all the Vedas. And his sense of hearing is the generating center of the sky and of all kinds of sound. So here is the purport. The word tirthanam is sometimes interpreted to mean places of pilgrimage, but Srila Jiva Goswami says that it means reception of the reception of the Vedic transcendental knowledge. The propounders of Vedic knowledge are also known as tirthas. Rupanam tejasam chakshur divya suryasya chakshurni karnao disham chatirtanam shrotram akasha shabdayoho. His eyes are the generating centers of all kinds of forms, and they glitter and illuminate. His eyeballs are like the sun and the heavenly planets. His ears hear from all sides and are the receptacles for all the Vedas. And his sense of hearing is the generating center of the sky and of all kinds of sound. So, as we might have heard yesterday, in the Narada Pancharatra, there's the verse Sarvapadi vinirmuktam tatparatvena nirmalam hrishikena hrishikesha sevanam bhaktir uchate, that the Supreme Lord is the origin of the senses, and all the senses are properly utilized in serving the Supreme Lord. So the senses come from the Supreme Lord, and they're properly utilized in serving the Supreme Lord. And this is a further sort of extension of what we have been hearing about the Virat Rup. And this chapter is entitled The Purusha Shukta Confirmed. So it's a kind of on the same line of the Supreme generating everything. What I wanted to start with today was these sections here, in Canto 2, chapters 5 and 6 and so forth. These tend to be somewhat mysterious in their explanation, because they deal a lot with creation. Creation is somewhat of a mysterious process. I just wanted to see if anyone had any specific questions about any aspect of this kind of section of Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam. Any questions about why it's there, or what all of this means, or some aspect of the Virat Purush or Virat Rup, known by various names, or any other thing. give you a few minutes to see if anything bubbles up here. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is there a difference between the universal form described in Bhagavatam and that in Bhagavad Gita, and what the focus is in those different texts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had that question myself, and I did some research through the Veda base, and it appears it's the same thing, more or less, that the universal form is mentioned in a number of places. Here, it's mentioned, as kind of in the larger unfolding of the creation of the universe is how it's seen in that context. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is demonstrating that he's the supreme being to Arjuna and to everyone else. Of course, Arjuna is not really too interested in that form, but he wants to underline the importance of Bhagavad Gita. So by underlining the importance of Bhagavad Gita, he asks Krishna to demonstrate himself as God. In chapter 10, which is called the opulence of the Absolute, Krishna is speaking how many, many kinds of opulent things come from him, which harkens back and is very similar to this chapter here in Bhagavatam, a similar thing. The opulence is the Absolute, chapter 10 of Bhagavad Gita, and this, which is the 6th chapter of the 2nd canto. And then, of course, he speaks about them in chapter 10, but in chapter 11, he actually manifests them. And this is the universal form. In Mahabharata, we also have some occasions where the universal form was displayed. Of course, again, since Bhagavad Gita is a part of Mahabharata, it's there. But a type of universal form was also displayed to Duryodhana when Krishna went as an emissary of the Pandavas, and he arrived in Hastinapur, and he was going to make a last-ditch effort to try to broker some kind of compromise between the Pandavas and the Kauravas before the Battle of Kurukshetra started. And Duryodhana was completely uninterested in any kind of compromise. And moreover, Duryodhana had hatched a plot to capture Krishna, and he was going to use Krishna as ransom. And so at a certain point, Duryodhana gave the signal, and all of his soldiers and henchmen were going to move forward and arrest Krishna. But Krishna looked at them and laughed and said, "Oh, you think I've come here alone?" And then out of Krishna's arms came the demigods and all these soldiers, and the universal form became displayed right there and then to Duryodhana and everyone who was at that assembly at that point, where Krishna was trying to reason with Duryodhana. And Duryodhana was gobsmacked or dumbfounded. He couldn't figure out what to do at all. So he just became inert. He didn't know where to what to do as a next step. So when this happened, then Krishna gradually reabsorbed the universal form back into himself and left. And later, when Duryodhana described the event, he said, Krishna demonstrated some yoga, or in this case, the word yoga means trick, so he just saw it as some kind of mystical trick that Krishna did. At any rate, so here we hear about the universal form again. And so in a number of places, this universal form is referenced. And since the first two cantos of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam kind of deal with creation. We do hear about it to some extent in the third canto too, but mostly it's here in the first and second cantos. The creation is described variously, but the way I think of it is kind of, you have Krishna in his two-arm form, which is easy for us to grasp, and then you have Krishna in his universal, not universal, but Brahman feature, which is the white light. But as we've been talking about, the white light is gradually transformed by the glance of the Supreme into the undifferentiated material energy, at first called the Pradhan, and then later on the Mahatat. And this is very difficult to grasp, this aspect, the Mahatat, which of course has no real features either. It's just one step removed from the Brahma Jyoti, or the Brahman, but it has no features. And gradually this develops out into the 24 elements of Sankhya philosophy and into this whole material world that we see around us. It becomes the manifested material external feature of the universe. And so this universal form is kind of, I think, between this Mahatat or Pradhan and the personal feature. It shows how through forms Krishna is expanded into everything that we see, kind of like a giant fractal or something like that. There are forms within forms and multiplicities and greater scales and minor scales. And here we're seeing that everything is coming from Krishna. The tangible things like the elements, our senses, the demigods controlling the senses. We see the abstract things like the Vedas, like so many other things. They're all being generated. And Arjuna saw this as one giant expansion. And he also saw the past and the future. There in the 11th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is describing that all things past and present are visible in this form, all in one place. And Arjuna sees not only himself, he sees the demigods, he sees various demons, he sees various warriors and soldiers, and then he sees the battle of Kurukshetra as soldiers entering into Krishna's flaming mouth and being destroyed. And of course, this is very terrifying, and Arjuna asks to, kind of wrap up the universal form. He's seen enough of it, and so Krishna does that. So this form shows how the formless, the Mahatat, is connected to the formed Krishna in his two-arm form. It's kind of like a progressive telescoping out from Krishna's two-arm form. We get various Vishnus, and we see this further expansion into all the demigods, et cetera, and then into the universal form. So this has been shown in various places and discussed in various places of the Vedas, more or less the same way. But here we are seeing it in its capacity as the method for expanding the universe. We're seeing it from that perspective. Any other questions about any aspect of the Purusha Sukta confirmed? Or this whole, developing narrative of creation? Yes.
I'm still confused about the eggs.
What's that?
I'm still confused about the eggs, the golden eggs.
The,
How do they manifest?
the which?
The universe that emanates from, we understand the universes emanate from the body of Mahavishnu.
Right,
And then
right.
somehow they become a golden. Do they emanate as golden eggs? Or do they emanate
We talked about that, I think, about 3 weeks ago. I'll give you a Reader's Digest version of recapitulating that. In different places in the Vedic writings that we look at, there are sort of 3 different pictures that are being presented. They are indeed the same thing, but we see it from 3 different angles. You know, one of the angles is, of course, the angle that we usually hear about and we speak about, you know, where it's kind of touched on in the first canto of Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam, where you have Mahavishnu, and as we heard a few verses ago, that there is a cloud that forms in the Brahma Jyoti in one corner, and this cloud absorbs 1/4 of the spiritual sky. And this is sometimes called the Ekapad Vibhuti in Sanskrit. And the rest of the spiritual sky is called the Tripad Vibhuti. And in Brahma Samhita, in Bhakti Siddhanta's description, he calls it the uniquadrental. He coins this term, you know, which sounds very mysterious when you hear it. But then later on he references the triquadrental, and so if he's calling it the uni means 1, of course, quadra means 4, so 1/4, and triquadrental is the 3/4. So this is the way Bhakti Siddhanta renders it into English. And it's the same thing. So in this uniquadrental cloud in one corner of the spiritual sky, which is also sometimes called the causal ocean or the Karana ocean, we have Karnadakshayi Vishnu, or Karnanavashayi Vishnu. There's a number of names for him. He lies down in this water, and from him all the universes bubble out, from his breathing and from the pores of his skin. That's one image that we get of creation. And, you know, that's, and then subsequent to that, we see that the causal Vishnu, or Karnadakshayi Vishnu, expands himself unlimitedly as Garbhodakshayi Vishnus, and those Garbhodakshayi Vishnus, one of each, enters into each bubbled out universe. And there, the Garbhodakshayi Vishnu witnesses an empty universe to which he, from his own perspiration, creates water that fills up 1/2 of it. And then he lies down on Anantasesh within this universal egg. And from his navel comes a lotus flower, which eventually generates Lord Brahma. So that's one image that we get of creation. The other image we get, a secondary image, is the image of this expansion or gradual precipitation of various kinds of elements from a undifferentiated, generalized, you know, sort of Mahatat. So it's described that the Supreme Lord glances at the material energy, this pradhan, and the pradhan is the first stage of the transformation of the, you know, Brahman. So it's being transformed into just basically an undifferentiated but in equilibrium kind of energy. Then when the Supreme glances at it, it becomes agitated and becomes the Mahatat. It goes from the Pradhan to the Mahatat. Then as the Mahatat, it further is agitated and becomes, first of all, the false ego or ahankara. Then it becomes the three modes of nature, you know, rajas, sattva, and tamas. Then the ahankara or false ego merges with the mode of goodness, which we call the Vaikārika phase. And in the Vaikārika phase, the mode of goodness and the false ego become the 10 demigods in charge of the senses. The mind is generated, and a few other things are generated at that point. Then we have the mode of passion. It merges with the false ego, and it creates the Taijasa phase. And from the Taijasa phase, we get the various senses, the knowledge acquiring senses, the working senses, and we get the intelligence that's generated from the Vaikārika phase. Then we have the Tamasa phase, where the mode of ignorance merges with the false ego, and it generates the Pancha Mahabhuta, the 5 gross elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether, and as well as the Tanmatra, the subtle sense objects, the form, touch, taste, sound, and smell, right? So all those 10 are generated. And this is a second picture. It's sounds different than the first picture we had, but essentially it's the same thing. It's kind of like the, 5 blind men and the elephant, where the different blind men go to experience the elephant, and one touches the leg, and one touches the belly, and one touches the ear, one touches the nose, one touches the tail, and they each explain the elephant in a very different way. The one that touches his belly says the elephant is very much like a boulder. The one that touches his leg says the elephant is exactly like a tree. And another one touches the elephant's ear and says the elephant is like a giant leaf. One touches his trunk and says the elephant's like a snake. And one touches his tail and says the elephant's like a rope. So which of them is right? The answer is that all of them are right, but none of them are complete. To a person with vision who can see, he can understand how each of these descriptions are basically a description of the same thing. But he can see how at the same time they're explanations for the same thing. Whereas the blind men, they can't. They have difficulty understanding how we're seeing the same thing. So in the same way, I sometimes use the analogy of a shopping mall, that when you are describing what a shopping mall is to someone who's never experienced one, you might describe, a construction crew coming in and clearing off a huge tract of land, and they dig a little bit of a pit. They make maybe parking decks in there, or maybe they just make a substructure, and then there's the first level, and maybe the second, possibly a third. And, they make a structure, and then various, individual mercantile organizations go in there and fill in the various cubicles that are part, et cetera. So you can describe it that way. Or you could describe a shopping mall as, a person who has an idea, then he does some market research, then he goes to meet some various, lending institutions, and he acquires the necessary financing, and then later on he's trying to figure out how to find employees, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is another way of describing a shopping. And the two seem quite different from one another, but actually it's the same thing, It's just describing it from different elements, and that's what we're going for. And the third explanation of creation is in the Brahma Samhita, where again we get another more mysterious, explanation of how the glance of the Supreme is called the dim halo, or Shambhu, and Shambhu is creating the material energy, and then further is generated Maya, or his wife, eventually. The material energy in the form of its bewildering potency. And then we find that from there we get subsequent generations. That's probably the most mysterious one, but at any rate, you have these, at least, there probably are more, but at least these three, sort of separate pictures of creation are there in the Vedic literature. And they are just explaining different aspects of the same kind of unfolding. You see there's some points of tangency between these three descriptions, but they're also kind of focused on how creation happens in a somewhat different manner. And then if you look at the whole thing, Sri Nandana, or Stephen Knapp, has written a book called How the Universe Was Created and Our Place in It. And he kind of discusses these various different aspects of creation. And all in all, there are 9 stages to creation. And the first 2 stages, or at least the first stage, is the creation by the Supreme Lord, where he creates the necessary ingredients or elements. Then from there on, Brahma takes it. Then we have, the creation of planetary systems. We have the creation of demigods. We have creation of various, animal species. And we have creation of, finally, the human beings. And then we have creation of some other things, So there are these various subsequent stages. And that's also referenced with different areas of Bhagavatam. So it's, a complex process. One thing I wanted to mention today is that this chapter is called the Purusha Sukta, Confirmed. And in Burijan's book, which is he has a book that is a sort of review or a study guide to Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam. And he describes that the Purusha Sukta, actually, Shu means auspicious or well, and Ukta means talk or well said. So it's a auspicious talk. And it's described within the Rig Veda. And the Purusha Sukta describes the Supreme in much the same terms that we are hearing here. That the Supreme is described as having many hands and many faces and expanding everywhere. And it's described also, let me see if I can remember any more details that Burijan highlights about the Purusha Sukta, that there's the cosmic egg, and the cosmic egg is first still, and then later on the Supreme enters into it as Garbhodakshaya Vishnu, and from this Garbhodakshaya Vishnu, he further expands. He expands himself to a form which is 10 fingers in height, and enters into the hearts of all living entities. And then it describes some other things, about the Supreme. And this is, I guess, how this ties into the Purusha Sukta, that we are hearing an explanation here in in chapter 6 of Canto 2, of this Purusha Sukta, which is being described, the prayer called the Purusha Sukta, in the Rig Veda. Any other questions that anyone has about, yes?
Just a question about the verse. Can you explain the Ashwini Kumars?
What, the Ashvini?
And what their function?
Yeah, there are in the Vedas 10. Sorry about that. I should turn it off. I just had the phone here because I use it in case this thing doesn't work. Okay, so it won't be disturbed. So there are 10 demigods in charge of the 10 senses. We have the, 5 knowledge-acquiring senses: the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, and the skin. And then we have and of course the mouth or the tongue. Then we have the 5 working senses, which are again the tongue, the arms, the legs, the belly, and the genitals. So, and the genitals and the anus is what it is, right? And these 5 working senses, each of them have a demigod that is in charge of that particular sensory modality. So the Ashvini Kumars, as we learn, is it today that's where we're hearing that? Yeah, it's 2 nostrils. Today we're learning that the Ashvini Kumar demigods are in charge of the nostrils or the noses. There's 2 nostril holes, and there's 2 Ashvini Kumar demigods. They're both twins. They're described in the Vedas. And these twin Ashvini Kumar demigods are in charge of medicine in some way, kind of like Dhanvantari, some way or another. They are the doctors for the demigods, the Ashvini Kumars. And what else do I know about them? I think that's pretty much it. Of course, I think it was that when Draupadi, no, not Draupadi, but when Kunti taught Madri the mantras for calling demigods, it was Madri who called the twin Ashvini Kumar demigods, who became the parents of, the last 2 Pandavas, Sahadev and, was it? Nakula, right, Nakula and Sahadev, right, Nakula and Sahadev. So they were the sons of Nakula and Sahadev, and of course, at that point, that was the end of the generation of the Pandavas. We didn't have any more Pandavas after that. So that's about all I can tell you about the Ashvini Kumar demigods, that they are in charge of medicine. So here we hear about Oshadi, which Oshada is the Sanskrit word for medicines, So this is the province of the Ashvini Kumars, that they understand. They are the nostrils. They control the breathing. They have they're deputized by the Supreme Lord to administer the breathing faculty of human beings. They are also in charge of medicinal herbs as they, administer them. And this, medicinal or healing property of the Ashvini demigods is described in the, what do they call it? The Ayurvedic literatures, where we learn about medicinal herbs and how they work, and that the Ashvini Kumars are in charge of them. And this Ayurveda comes to us from the Dhanvantari avatar, when Dhanvantari comes out of the milk ocean during the churning. So we have the Ayurvedic knowledge. Of course, our present understanding of the Ayurveda is spotty, because the entire Atharva Veda, not the entire Atharva, but the entire Ayurveda is not existing still. There's only pieces of it. So that's why it's an incomplete document. So we will, in the course of this chapter, start to see more how all these things are connected to the Supreme Lord. Everything is connected to the Supreme Lord, but in some ways it's obvious, and at least to us as devotees, it's obvious how things are connected. And in other ways, it's not obvious at all. So the material world is designed in such a way that it generates itself and then hides the method by which it was generated. So the material world, the external energy of the material world is designed in such a way that it blocks the living entity from understanding where it came from and how it got set up. It's designed that way. It's not an accident. And only those who are serious about trying to learn about the Supreme Lord and serve the Supreme Lord, only those people will be able to break through or to lift the veil on where the universe came from. Whereas those who are not interested will not be able to do that. Instead, they will be bewildered by various theories and appearances. The material world is kind of designed to generate constant appearances, like the way clouds generate what appear to be various forms. So clouds may at one time look like some kind of fruit, another time they may look like an elephant or a horse or something like that. But they're just sort of ethereal shapes. So in the same way, material science and Western philosophy is all about trying to understand these cloud shapes that never actually give us any substance. They just appear for some time to be something that is abstract and at the foundation of the world that we live in. But the more you examine it, the more you find that you're dealing with a cloudy shape that never coalesces into anything. But those who study the Vedic literature and try to engage in devotional service, they do penetrate that veil on the mystery of how this universe works, the mystery of how this universe was designed, and the mystery of how it unfolded. They penetrate that through the narration of the Vedic literatures, and they can understand in a logical progression how essentially the universe is created and how it's deployed and why we want to get out of it. You know, these are things that are available to those who make the effort to understand and serve the Supreme Lord. So that's why we're learning about it. And the more you actually hear about it, the more you come to the understanding that the material world is a complicated thing. It's not very straightforward, and it's very complex. And that's why Krishna designs it that way. So if a living entity is predisposed to want to stay here and enjoy it, then you can do that. You have reasons to do that. You are bewildered by its nature because you can't see through the veil. So you assume these cloudy forms that are given by various philosophers and scientists. You assume those to be factual when in fact they're not. And you can go on in the false idea that you will either live forever, or if you don't live forever, it's all over, and so it doesn't matter what you do while you're living, and that's the end of it. All right, so any other final questions or realizations or comments? Yes?
Question. When you were describing the offspring of Mars, you were saying how different demigods are in charge of the different processes of our senses. I always had this question, does that mean that they are in charge directly of each individual person? Or how does that work? Or is there offering within every flame throughout creation? Or is Varuna within water, even in the sink when we brush our teeth? How does that work?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It isn't exactly spelled out. I tend to assume that the way it works is something like, you know, where you have the waterworks somewhere here in New York City. You've got some man who's sitting in some control room and generating, or rather controlling where the water goes in the same way as, you know, the person sitting in some big electrical, control center kind of apportions where the bulk of the electricity comes from and where it winds up going, something like that. Except, of course, the way this works in the universal administration is through sound vibration. So through various mantras, it's possible to control. And it appears that it's controllable in specificity all the way down to even an individual, you know, because there appears to be some kind of, control even of whether the senses work or not, you know, even down to the level of an individual human being, because that's one of the ways karma plays itself out, is that according to our deeds, our past karma, we generate a future for ourselves, and even part of that future is whether we get fully functional senses or sometimes not fully functional senses. In some cases, the use of the senses can become impaired, you know, sometimes in ways that doctors and medical professionals can't exactly figure out, you know. That's the mysterious thing about it, because the demigods administer the functioning of the senses, includes the mind as well. I recently became aware of an unusual phenomenon that's called, how do they term it again? Sort of end-of-life lucidity, it's called. That people who have been in some kind of care facility, you know, in some medical care facility, that have been mostly vegetative for months, suddenly an hour or two, they come out of a completely vegetative state. They communicate with people in the room, you know, in fully functional way, and then shortly thereafter they die and they leave. And this is something that a lot of end-of-life care professionals have witnessed over and over again. It's not a one-time phenomenon. It's not an often phenomenon. It's a rare phenomenon. But it does occur, and it happens quite a lot. And of course, Western medicine has absolutely no explanation for how this could possibly occur. How can a degenerative physical, either disease or degenerative condition of the body suddenly be bypassed in just a few moments? The person acts normally, communicates normally, and then dies, you know. There's no, from a material point of view, this whole thing makes no sense whatsoever. But it happens. And so somehow or other, the demigods in charge of the modalities of the senses just kind of say, okay, for a while you can communicate. And, you know, the person says something to their loved ones or so that are around the bed and then immediately dies, you know. So, you know, from a material standpoint, it makes no sense. And we see this also, that there are a lot of peculiar things about the way the senses work that don't make sense from a materialistic medical point of view. They're completely inexplicable. Another one of them, of course, is the idea that there's a condition called hydrocephalia, which is water on the brain. So sometimes children are born, and instead of the normal folds, you know, the whole, you know, 5 lobes of the brain, you know, the temporal, the frontal, the parietal, and occipital, instead of all these various lobes of the brain, mostly they don't develop. And instead, there's a great degree of cerebral spinal fluid that takes the place of all this structure in the brain. And what's bizarre about this is that of some of these people who actually have something like 60 to 80% of the brain structure missing in their body because of hydrocephalia, this condition. These people are normal functioning people in the world. In fact, in some cases, there was one story about one of them who is a well-regarded mathematics professor now. So someone with like 80% of their brain substance missing, you know, which means that how is this happening? You know, there's no medical explanation for how this is possible. But somehow or another, these modalities of the senses, the mind, and the expression of the human soul in its contact of things coming in and its reaction to the world going out, these things can be mediated directly without any of the need of the physical structure of the body. But generally they're not. So generally these things do work according to the usual medical and physical laws, but there are these strange cases where it points to the fact that there's something else going on here. There's more than just the physical body. And I point these things out because this shows how our modern worldview of the modern world, the Weltanschauung of the world, the way people see it, is incomplete. You know, that there are these edge cases where Krishna allows the real mystery of what's going on in this world to shine through a little bit for those who are willing to pay attention, But those who are committed scientific atheists and materialists, those people, they just discount all those senses, all those cases, and write them off because they don't fit into their package of thinking. Okay, so I don't want to keep you all any longer. Thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava Buddhism.